Welcome to Life Story 999. Today, we're sharing an extraordinary story about honor, bravery, and the power of brotherhood. This is the tale of Harold, a 92-year-old war veteran who, against all odds, faces a group of disrespectful bikers at a small-town diner. With unwavering courage, Harold's response leaves everyone in awe. If this story moves you, don't forget to like the video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Harold, a decorated World War II veteran, lived a life of quiet routine, but his spirit remained as unyielding as it had been during his years of service. On a warm, sunny afternoon, he made his way to Rosie's Diner, his favorite spot for a simple meal and some friendly conversation. As he parked his old pickup truck and stepped out, the familiar sound of laughter and chatter greeted him. But this time, it carried an edge that he hadn't heard before. A group of young bikers, their motorcycles gleaming in the midday sun, had gathered outside the diner. They were loud, their laughter echoing across the parking lot as they joked amongst themselves, clearly enjoying their own sense of power and bravado. As Harold approached the entrance, one of the bikers stepped in front of him, blocking his path. He sneered, looking Harold up and down with disdain, clearly judging him by his age and appearance. "Hey, old man, isn't it past your bedtime?" the biker taunted, his friends bursting into laughter behind him. Harold looked at the young man, his eyes steady and unwavering. The years had taken their toll on his body, but they had also given him a strength these boys couldn't comprehend. A strength forged in the battlefields of Europe amidst the chaos of war, and the camaraderie of soldiers who would lay down their lives for one another. Harold stood tall, his eyes meeting the bikers without a hint of fear. "Son," he said calmly, "I've faced men far tougher than you, and I'm still here. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to get my lunch." His voice was even, his words carrying a weight that made the laughter falter, if only for a moment. But the bikers weren't ready to back down. They surrounded him, mocking and jeering, trying to get a rise out of the old man. They had no idea who they were dealing with, no idea the battles Harold had fought, both on and off the battlefield. Inside the diner, Rosie watched anxiously. She knew Harold well. She knew the kind of man he was. He wasn't one to seek trouble, but he certainly wouldn't run from it either. As she reached for the phone, ready to call for help, Harold made his own move. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out his phone and made a call, not to the police, but to an old friend. Within minutes, the rumble of more motorcycles filled the parking lot, but these weren't the bikes of young punks. They were ridden by men who, like Harold, had served their country, who understood the true meaning of courage and respect. They were his brothers in arms, men who would always answer the call when one of their own was in need. The bikers, seeing the arrival of Harold's friends, quickly realized they had made a mistake. This wasn't just some frail old man. This was a hero, a man whose strength came not from his muscles, but from his heart, his loyalty, and his unwavering sense of honor. In the end, Harold didn't need to throw a single punch. His friends stood by his side, and the bikers, now humbled, backed away, realizing they were no match for the kind of power that comes from true brotherhood. Harold's story is a testament to bravery, resilience, and the enduring bonds of service. It reminds us all that true strength isn't about age or physical power. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the odds, and knowing that you are never alone as long as your friends who stand by you. Inside the diner, the patrons grew silent as they watched the scene unfold outside. The young bikers had formed a loose circle around Harold, cutting him off from the entrance. Their taunts and jeers grew louder, each insult designed to provoke a reaction. Harold stood in the center, his face calm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, a patience wearing thin. Rosie, the owner of the diner, watched from behind the counter, her brow furrowed with concern. She had known Harold for years, had heard his stories of courage and survival. She knew he wasn't the kind to back down, but she also knew the dangers of confrontation, especially with a group of young men full of bravado. Her fingers hovered over the phone, ready to call for help, but she hesitated, watching Harold carefully. One of the bikers, a tall young man with tattoos snaking down his arms, stepped forward and snatched Harold's phone from his hand. He held it up, waving it mockingly as he sneered. "What's this, old man? Calling for backup? Who are you going to call?" "The nursing home." His friends roared with laughter, their voices echoing in the otherwise quiet parking lot. Harold took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the biker who held his phone. The laughter and taunts faded into the background as memories of his time in the service flashed through his mind. The harsh training, the battles fought, the comrades lost. He remembered the bullies he had faced, not just on the battlefield, but throughout his life. He had learned long ago that strength wasn't about who was the loudest or the biggest. It was about resilience, about standing up for yourself and others, no matter the odds. "Give me my phone," Harold said, his voice steady, carrying a quiet authority that made the laughter falter. The young biker paused, his sneer fading as he looked into Harold's eyes, seeing something there that made him hesitate. But before the moment could shift, another biker, emboldened by the crowd, jeered, "Or what, old man? You gonna teach us a lesson?" The tension thickened, the air almost crackling with anticipation. Rosie couldn't wait any longer. She picked up the phone, her fingers trembling as she began to dial for the police. But before she could press the final number, she saw Harold make a move. Slowly, deliberately, Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out a second phone, a much older model, worn and scratched. He flipped it open and began to dial, his eyes never leaving the young men surrounding him. The bikers exchanged confused glances, their bravado slipping as they watched the old man make his call. There was something about his calmness, his unwavering gaze, that unsettled them. Harold finished dialing and put the phone to his ear. "Charlie," he said, his voice calm but with a weight that spoke volumes. "It's time." Rosie's heart skipped a beat as she watched from the window. The rumble of distant engines began to fill the air, growing louder with each passing second. The bikers, still trying to appear unfazed, turned their heads towards the sound. They couldn't have known that Harold had friends who, like him, had faced real battles, men who knew what it meant to stand up for one another. Within minutes, a group of motorcycles rolled into the parking lot, each bike carrying a rider with an air of quiet authority. These weren't young punks. They were seasoned men, veterans like Harold, who had answered the call without a moment's hesitation. They parked their bikes, forming a line behind Harold, their presence a silent testament to the bond they all shared, a brotherhood forged in the fires of war. The young bikers, now outnumbered and visibly unnerved, glanced at each other, their bravado evaporating under the weight of the veterans' silent stares. The leader of the group, the one holding Harold's phone, hesitated before handing it back, his eyes downcast. Harold took it without a word, slipping it back into his pocket as he stepped forward. "Respect," Harold said, his voice carrying across the lot, "isn't something you get by pushing others around. It's something you earn." His words hung in the air, a challenge and a lesson all at once. The young bikers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to the men standing behind Harold. Men who had lived through more than these boys could imagine, men who knew the true cost of freedom and courage. The leader of the bikers nodded, swallowing hard. We didn't mean any disrespect," he mumbled, taking a step back. One by one, the young men turned, walking away from the diner, their swagger gone, replaced by a quiet humility. Harold watched them go, his face impassive until they were out of sight. Then, slowly, he turned to his friends, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The rumble of engines faded, replaced by the quiet murmur of relieved patrons inside the diner. Rosie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her eyes meeting Harold's through the window. She gave him a nod, a silent thank you for standing his ground without letting the situation spiral out of control. Harold's friends clapped him on the shoulder, their presence a reminder that true strength comes not from muscle but from loyalty, honor, and the willingness to stand up for what's right. Together, they walked into the diner, the tension of moments before dissipating into the warmth of friendship and respect. Harold stood still, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension surrounding him. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, retrieving an old, worn phone. It was a relic from his past, but it still worked, and today, it would serve a purpose far greater than its original intent. He flipped the phone open and dialed a number he knew by heart. As the phone rang, Harold kept his gaze on the young bikers, his expression unwavering. On the other end, Charlie picked up almost immediately. "Harold," came the familiar voice, gruff but warm. It had been years since they had served together, but the bond between them had never weakened. They had been through too much war, loss, and the fight to return to a normal life. Harold didn't need to explain much. His voice was calm but carried the gravity of the situation. "Charlie, I'm at Rosie's diner. Could use some backup," Harold said simply. There was no hesitation. Charlie knew what those words meant. He'd heard that tone in Harold's voice before. The same steady resolve that had seen them through battlefields and enemy lines. "On my way," Charlie replied, his voice laced with an urgency that belied his years. Without a word more, he hung up, and within moments, he was gathering their old crew, men who had served side by side, who understood the importance of loyalty. Back at the diner, Harold slipped the phone back into his pocket. He could see the bikers were still trying to maintain their bravado, but there was a flicker of uncertainty now. Something about the quiet confidence in Harold's demeanor unsettled them. They couldn't understand why this old man seemed so unfazed, why he didn't appear afraid. He was outnumbered older, and yet there was no hint of fear in his eyes. Minutes passed, and just as the young bikers were about to push their taunts further, the rumble of distant engines began to grow. The sound rolled in like a wave, gaining volume until it filled the parking lot. The bikers turned, their expressions shifting from arrogance to confusion as they saw a group of motorcycles approaching. These weren't flashy, custom bikes. They were well-worn, the kind that had seen years of use, the kind ridden by men who knew what it meant to face real danger. Charlie led the group, his eyes scanning the scene as they rolled in, the veterans parking their bikes in a line behind Harold. They dismounted, moving with a deliberate calmness that spoke of discipline and experience. These were men who had faced far greater threats than a few unruly punks. They gathered behind Harold, their silent presence more powerful than any words they could have spoken. The young bikers, now visibly outnumbered and intimidated, began to realize their mistake. The sneers and jeers faded, replaced by uneasy glances. The leader, the one who had taken Harold's phone, hesitated, then stepped forward, handing it back. His eyes dropped, no longer able to meet Harold's steady gaze. "We didn't mean any trouble, old man," he muttered. Harold took the phone, slipping it back into his pocket. "Respect isn't something you demand," he said, his voice carrying across the lot. "It's something you earn." The young men nodded, the fight gone from them. They turned and left, their footsteps heavy with the weight of a lesson learned. Charlie stepped forward, clapping Harold on the shoulder. "Always knew you'd find a way to keep things interesting," he said with a grin. Harold smiled, a warmth in his eyes as he looked at the men who had come to his side. They were older now, the years marked on their faces, but the bond between them was timeless. Together, they walked towards a diner, leaving the tension behind. The rumble of engines died down, replaced by the comforting clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation inside. Rosie watched from the counter, relief softening her expression as she saw Harold and his friends enter. She gave Harold a nod, a silent acknowledgement of his quiet bravery. Harold nodded back, the small smile still on his face. He wasn't alone, and he never would be. Not as long as he had friends who would always answer the call. The deep rumble of motorcycles filled the air, growing louder as they approached. The young bikers glanced around, their expressions shifting from smugness to confusion, then to apprehension. It wasn't long before Charlie and a group of veterans rolled into the parking lot, their presence commanding instant respect. These men, each carrying the weight of years of service, still moved with a confidence that was unmistakable. They parked their bikes in unison, the roar of the engines slowly dying, leaving only the tense silence that hung in the air. Charlie, his eyes sharp beneath his helmet, scanned the scene in front of him. The young bikers stood clustered together, their bravado slipping as they took in the sight of the veterans. Older men, but with an unmistakable air of discipline and experience. Harold stood at the center, his posture straight, a quiet determination in his gaze. Without hesitation, Charlie and the others formed a loose circle around Harold, their presence a silent declaration of solidarity. The young bikers, now clearly outnumbered and realizing they had underestimated Harold, began to shift uncomfortably. The leader of the group, the one who had taken Harold's phone, took a small step back, his eyes darting nervously from Harold to the veterans. There was no mistaking the seriousness in the air. These weren't men to be trifled with. The veterans stood tall, their faces hardened by years of challenges far greater than the posturing of a few young men. Charlie stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel as he moved. His gaze locked on the leader of the young bikers, and his voice, though calm, carried an edge that demanded respect. "You boys made a big mistake today," he said, his words slicing through the silence. "This man here, Harold, he's earned more respect than you could possibly understand. You think you're tough, picking on an old man? You have no idea what real toughness is." The young leader swallowed hard, his eyes falling to the ground. The rest of the bikers looked at each other, their earlier bravado entirely gone. They shifted on their feet, the weight of the veteran's presence pressing down on them. Charlie took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the young man in front of him. "You owe this man an apology," he said, his voice steady but leaving no room for argument. "Not just to him, but to every veteran who ever put on a uniform." The young leader hesitated for a moment, then slowly nodded. He looked up, his eyes meeting Harold's for the first time without the veil of arrogance. I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He glanced at the other veterans, his gaze dropping again as he added, "We didn't mean any disrespect." Harold watched him, his face impassive, then gave a slight nod. "Apology accepted," he said, his voice calm but firm. He knew the power of forgiveness, but he also knew the importance of making sure the lesson was learned. Charlie stepped back, his eyes still on the young bikers, making sure they understood the gravity of the moment. The young men began to back away, their eyes downcast, their bravado entirely replaced by a humbled silence. They turned, moving towards their bikes, and within moments, the roar of their engines filled the air once again as they rode away, the arrogance they had arrived with nowhere to be found. The veterans watched them go, their expressions unreadable until the last of the young bikers disappeared from sight. Charlie turned back to Harold, a smile breaking through his stern expression. He clapped Harold on the shoulder, his grip firm. "You always knew how to draw a crowd," he said, his voice lightening the tension that had held the air so tightly. The other veterans gathered around, their camaraderie evident in the way they exchanged nods and pats on the back. They had come not just to support Harold, but to remind everyone present, including themselves, of the bond that never faded, no matter how many years passed. Rosie, watching from inside the diner, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes misty as she watched Harold and his friends. She knew these men had faced more than most people could imagine, and today they had shown once again that they were always ready to stand up for one another. She opened the door, the bell chiming softly as she stepped outside. "Why don't you boys come in?" she called, her voice thick with emotion. "I think you've earned yourselves a cup of coffee." The veterans exchanged smiles, their hardened expressions softening as they turned towards the diner. Harold gave Charlie a nod, then gestured towards the door. "After you, old friend," he said, his voice warm. Charlie chuckled, shaking his head. "Still the same, Harold," he said, and together they made their way inside, the tension of the confrontation fading into the comfort of friendship and respect. As the tension eased and the young bikers disappeared into the distance, Harold took a deep breath and looked around at his friends, a grateful smile touching his lips. The veterans stood beside him, their silent support unwavering, and Harold knew this was the moment to remind everyone why they stood together. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice carrying across the diner, drawing the attention of everyone inside. "You know, there was a time during the war when I didn't think I'd make it," Harold began, his eyes growing distant as he spoke. "We were surrounded, pinned down with no hope of immediate rescue. We had lost so many, and the fear was almost overwhelming. But it wasn't just my own courage that kept me going. It was the men beside me, men like Charlie here." He nodded towards his old friend, who returned the gesture with a respectful smile. "We weren't just soldiers," Harold continued. "We were brothers. In those moments, the only thing that mattered was making sure the man next to you survived. We faced challenges far greater than anything today, but we got through it because we had each other. That's what true loyalty is. Standing by one another, no matter how bad things get. And that's a lesson that has stayed with me every single day of my life." His words resonated deeply, and a heavy silence filled the diner as everyone listened. The patrons, who had watched the confrontation unfold, now saw Harold not just as an old man, but as a symbol of the kind of courage and loyalty that was all too rare. The veterans around him nodded, each of them understanding the truth of his words from their own experiences. Harold's grandson, who had arrived just in time to witness the standoff, stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with admiration. He had always known his grandfather was a man of strength, but today he saw a side of him that went beyond stories and memories. He saw a living example of honor and resilience. As Harold spoke, the boy felt a swell of pride and a determination to live up to the example his grandfather had set. Harold smiled at his grandson, then looked back at his friends and the people in the diner. "Remember," he said, his voice filled with warmth, "respect and courage aren't just words. They're actions. They're how you treat the people around you, how you stand up for what's right, no matter what. And the best part is, you don't have to do it alone." The veterans nodded in agreement, their eyes meeting Harold's, and a sense of unity filled the room, a reminder that true brotherhood never fades. It lives on in the bonds they shared and in the lessons they passed down, from one generation to the next. As the diner settled back into a comfortable hum, Harold and his grandson sat at a booth, sharing a quiet meal. The tension had dissipated, replaced by the warmth of family and camaraderie. Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn challenge coin, holding it out to his grandson. The young boy looked up, his eyes wide with curiosity as Harold placed a coin in his hand. "This," Harold began, his voice gentle but firm, "isn't just a coin. It's a symbol of commitment, honor, and the promise we make to always stand up for what's right." He paused, meeting his grandson's gaze. "True strength isn't about muscles or how tough you look. It's about having the courage to stand your ground, to protect those who can't protect themselves, and to do what's right, even when it's hard." His grandson's eyes shone with admiration, and he closed his fingers around the coin, nodding. "I promise, Grandpa," he said earnestly, "I'll always try to live up to what this means." Harold smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He knew the future was in good hands, and the values he held dear would live on. The quiet moment between grandfather and grandson was interrupted by the sound of applause. The patrons in the diner, moved by what they had witnessed, began clapping, their admiration evident. Rosie stepped forward, her eyes misty with emotion. "Harold, you and your friends have earned more than just a cup of coffee today," she said warmly. "This meal is on the house. For all of you." The veterans exchanged smiles, their hardened expressions softening at Rosie's words. They nodded in appreciation, their bond evident not just in the way they stood together in the face of adversity, but in the way they now shared a moment of peace. The young bikers had left, humbled and quieter, but Harold and his friends remained, a living testament to the enduring power of respect, courage, and brotherhood. As Harold looked around the diner at the familiar faces of his comrades and the hopeful gaze of his grandson, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Today had been a reminder that the values they had fought for still mattered, and as long as there were people willing to carry the torch, those values would never fade. Harold's story reminds us that true strength lies not in physical power, but in courage, honor, and respect for others. His actions show that even in moments of adversity, dignity and unity can bring about powerful change. If you were inspired by Harold's story, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Life Story 999 for more impactful stories like this. Let's carry forward these lessons of respect and resilience into our own lives.